When we close our eyes, the secret work of flavor houses starts, enlarging grain build and yeast migration. Flush rivets of the fuselage lift spirits. Doors are equipped with slides, and I would hold you, but they're overbooked and turned away standbys. Just know you're mine. And the trip will soon fix issues shrunk to steady textures. It's not certain it will be cherished, but we can certainly count on fluids, or being beside that place too large not to be in the center of it all the time, detecting hints of toffee and cane in the vents, noting how the sweeping glass curves of the roof subsume the worry of not enough drought-tolerant fruit. Somehow I miss the TVs unfolding and am lost as progress is retrograde, for the gold rush, not the way we're pointed, though it seems to be the hour of arrows and engineers. Do not disturb my circles, say the teeth behind soaked hands in the movie, with the girl next door gazing through a rusty screen, knowing this is one of many thresholds before her hopes are dashed by the hostess job, resolving a lazy Susan near blossom cart backs and crashing into matriarchs orbiting in their beam. Until waves curl the other way to cancel praise and complaint. We return from the theory of inside, where speed is silent, wishing on blistered grapes between stars, before charcuterie plates rattle and rouse and landing cards are tendered to find the 6-row barley herald sugar, and the cooperage learn the best way to bend staves to urge a deeper soak line. Though the strain needs laddering, nosing, sweet mouthfeel, a bridge between rounds. We heed chimes in the litany of arrival, conceived as thoroughfare control, as revenuers seeking dark trees, to pedal spent grain as mystic provender to the blue horizon before the pilot puts us down. This is called Cloud in the Shape of the Goths. The film in question is a counting animal with lines applied in scorn, sloping starboard and viewed more times due to a clickbait ornament. It tries to wipe the link between those that dreamed of the gayest hardcore punk and a mini lesson of mortuaries carrying peasants to church. Your drop down is a gaze on the lower Danube, lingering in the chill of baptismal water, if only out of respect for the dead. The new need despoilers to spread the weight of tall walls, matching savagery with kissing, their banners lifting damp and reducing sperm count. Please remember to use blood as an accent color to boost announcing in your mirror. Why raise a rain gutter when you can create a monster? The bondage pants of debutantes may devise a buttress to sorrow, but any backwoods thinker struggles to solve medieval problems, like balloon folding, in the sense that Bela Lugosi's gone, striving to be exact in a manner that has soured, knowing the vaulted ceiling is a workhorse in corpse paint, referring to pale complexity. Your vampire singing may be stuck on horizontal, but is crucial to the return of black gloss in the trailer park. Trinity exposed with a slow shudder. Truth beholding the plot behind clear story math, the armature of pipe masonry edging the release of light. Thank you. Yeah. No. This is called Cloud in the Shape of the Rapture, brought to you by KFC. An order of thighs sent through static has more sway on delight than 8 bars of the king and I. Tines of their sporks are best tuned to eating soup. The second shift drops a lot to keep head count up, as do pendants spoofing infinity into the parking lot. Telephone lines accrue, a cloud, a tree, a lodestar, the corner of a sign. On TV, the contestant buys a vowel to solve a thing and win a trip to Orangeries. One cop car means a run on biscuits, 2's responding to a false alarm from yesterday. A tree nurse yields to trumpet creeper and gets trouble to go. Others hope for a jingoist whoosh. Lower gas prices remain a tailwind if we agree not to install malware or launch packet flows. The fry cook takes a breather between baskets and keeps a weather eye on wings. The postmodern kernel in white on white on white is all about revelations, like winning back position in the top chicken Could be 5 for 5 this time instead of 2 by 2. Finger looking good. Okay, this is my last poem. It conflates two ecstatic experiences I had. One was visiting the Rothko Chapel outside of Houston. Have anybody been there and seen that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it's 14 Rothko paintings, and it's a place of meditation and celebration. And the other experience was for the only time trying an edible. I haven't had THC in my body for like 45 years, and I can tell you that THC has upped its game. So this is cloud in the shape of an edible inside the Rothko Chapel. It's a 4-minute poem, so have a drink, hang in there, and then to be rewarded with some of the best music you'll ever hear. When a guest trips past tomorrow's apples with verges firmly drawn to find the vessel where the host is kept and eats divinity, the party goes south. I lift the gummy to my mouth, and every salivary swells in syrup, heralding a sly distillate trying to balance folly and weight with the location of self and its ambience, to tell if I repeat disturbances or declare there's nothing moral about a trolley. The paintings sell in purple as lay recitals, altered by the strongest draft, replacing something of care for inclement days, when bearings fade and pewter drops its freight to claim a sky already dead. Several schemes vie to be topmost in my head, to see gradients beyond the pledge of sizzle from a heaven stripped of pigments, crafted by that old and evil plumage once myth starts to fizzle. Who is God? Get me God. Give me a God type. Give me a young God. This bucolic circus, diffused by real study, is built at full scale in the fraught value of gloom, confessing a human caked in grease in the last out of the clown car in a temple of unbelief, crowned for ecumenical conviction. Through wild onions dancing early, and breathing in that made place of new airs from old world birds, sounded by rosin wheel, turned by blue, 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 asking among tonic and transcription, what reaps steel from these cold remains in the manner of fenestrations? Through a stand of dogwood after all deciduous let fall, that holds up chocolate in high percentage and lifts spirits from an ocean of surcease, looping like a Ouroboros inked on the wrist of a barista, sculpting foam and botanical taxa, or a kind of worship in a cup. Through the memory play of a church repast, where swearing a chisel is the most beautiful thing, casting butter beans and okra as diving in with bated breath, and trusting fingers over turbulence, or a plush lamb once you float off to your fate. When doubt becomes the pentimenti of crimson, working the middle of plums, or shades left nodding to Byzantine, is faith edged in a harbinger of gore, the transmutation of blood and bread held firm with rabbit skin glue in the bandit tradition that robs with clean hands and walks me through undertone as mind spill, throbbing tragedy, ecstasy, doom. Who is God? Give me God. Get me a God type. Give me a young God. Synoptic semblance agrees even where deviancy is manifest. I fancy death outside the place of ascent, spun by books that don't admit a clash of codes. Dosage is the trope of a simulated day standing in for corruptions that creep into the text of the body, or emissions that burn to trim clay, selling the magic of notes left out among hard-edged limits, and Texas outbuilding Xness, shaking heavy cream to butter in a jar with signs of my blood, my kin, in love with admitting light, bright as Pindar's doves, braiding red-eye gradient sun. An off-campus blade inside the elbow to the wrist, opening with tuning and spilling ambrosia by framing measure and monument, and elides his lids, his hooks, his wounds, evincing a sheen the internal lacks, and pushes back on adoring the plumbing ground. The last paint job is the climax of the sonnet, sorting signals bidding to abide behind three on the tree, not driving or naming key in the usual way, and reading marrow spread by passage. These lyrics rise or swoon together and praying beyond the role of redeemer, lowered by tackles to keep me swallowing bliss. Thank you very much.
Once more for Ken Taylor, please. We had a tremendous time last night with Ken and Ed Roberson and Kai Eames, who are going to be speaking later. We are going to have a good time tonight too. So thank you for being here. Thanks to the Green Mill, thanks to Dave Gemolo, thanks to the staff. They're all amazing and encourage us to be amazing as well. So before we start, I'd like to mention that the idea to have the poets speak goes to my partner in crime, Ellen Major. I've been hanging out a little bit more with some poetry writers and fans of poetry, and it's been kind of blowing my mind. And she's like, well, why don't you put them on stage with you? So that's her idea, so she gets credit. She gets commission on that. We're going to start off with a piece called Voigtlander Brilliance, and thanks very much for being here. her. She says it's all good, but we know that means it's not.
Oh, just a little bit less though. A little bit less keyboard and electronics.
Less keyboard and electronics for the drummer. While we're sorting that out, we're going to talk about the next piece. This next one's called Prop. A lot of propping going on right now. Lots of props. Including me grabbing the wrong instrument. I need a new prop. Thank you very much. The last piece is called Tall Horse. It's written for the great Getachew Macri, who the hardest job I ever had playing music was learning his music, his Ethiopian music. And I had my ass kicked every single day at Terry Hessel's, the ex-house. When we rehearsed this music every day, it changed. And every morning I'd sit at the kitchen table writing out parts, and he would just look at me and look at Terry and go, like, why did you hire this guy? And I'd play parts and he would do this. And then broken music. And I finally got it together enough to do the gigs, and he really was extraordinary to me. And I knew I had finally broken through when the band playing with Getachew, the X and friends, at a concert in London, and there's a really large Ethiopian population there. And he was totally holding court before the gig, surrounded by all these very beautiful women, and just really happy. And this waiter came over to me, and I'm not exaggerating, it was a pint glass completely filled with scotch. And the night before, we had been celebrating after a gig with a glass of scotch. And then I said, like, I definitely did not order this. I never drink before I play. And he said, oh, it's from him. And Getachew sitting there, he's like, yeah. Like, if I had drunk that pint of scotch, I would have been unconscious. So that goes out to Getachew. This next one goes out to Sonny Rollins, my hero. He's the reason I play tenor saxophone. This is called Nuke Jetzt.
Thank you very much. Let's take a short break. Beth McDonald, tuba. Finnegan, drums. Macri, bass, Berman, cornet. Erez Dessel, keyboard. Vandermark, Erez Dessel. Thanks again to Ken Taylor. We're back with more words and music.